Today in the show, we're traveling back to 1991 to discuss an 8-month event at Disneyland that people have varying opinions on. If you grew up in the 80s or 90s, you probably loved it. If you were an adult at the time, there's a good chance you thought it was cheap and tacky. I'm speaking of Afternoon Avenue, which was a sort of precursor to Mickey's Toontown, featuring characters that were particularly popular to kids at the time. Characters like Scrooge McDuck, Gruffi Gummi, Gadget, Baloo, and so many more were all featured in this temporary land. Joining me to discuss is Modern Mouse Josh, who actually got to experience Afternoon Avenue when he was a kid visiting Disneyland. Although I didn't get to personally experience it at the time, I did get a taste of it when Disneyland recreated it somewhat fairly recently. So step right up and come on in as we celebrate Disneyland's Afternoon Avenue.
It's time to turn back the clock because nostalgia is king.
Hello and welcome back to the show, Josh Taylor. How you doing today, sir?
I'm doing fantastic. It's been a few months since we last talked, and I'm excited to get into a topic that I personally know quite a bit about.
Yes, so this actually was prompted by our last episode where we were talking about the different lands in Disneyland and how we might modernize and bring more current properties to some of the lands. And Afternoon Avenue in Disneyland was mentioned, and you dropped a bomb on me. You said, "Oh yes, I experienced that in person," to which I was flabbergasted because that had been a dream of mine when I was a kid living on the East Coast. You know, I never made it out for this very short celebration. It was about 8 months long. It opened in March 15th, 1991, closed November 10th, 1991, so only about 8 months. But before we jump into the details of it, I must say that I know of at least one listener who, when we talked about it, and when I've talked about it on the past on the podcast, he goes, "If you ever do an episode about that, I will not listen to it." Oh. Adamantly against Afternoon Avenue. Apparently some very split opinions on this. And listen, I get it. We were the right age, right? This was something that I think if we saw something like this put together today, we might have some strong, negative, strong opinions about it. It wasn't the most elaborate. It wasn't the most high budget thing, but it definitely hit a mood for the right age group, and we were the right age group. So I totally understand, but we need to talk about it. So we're going to talk about it. Sound fair?
Sounds fair to me, and I already apologize to the one person who doesn't want to hear it.
Oh, he's probably not listening. I'm sure he sees the title of this episode and is like, skip, and I'm okay with that. That's perfectly fine. As I mentioned, opened March of 91, closed in November of 91, located in the Small World Mall. Did you know that they call this the mall? I always find this weird when I hear the term Small World Mall, because how is it a mall?
Well, it kind of goes to the same idea of arcade changing over time, right? Like when you go and you see the Penny Arcade on Main Street, you go like, oh wow, maybe they have Mortal Kombat. At least that's what I thought of when I was a kid, right? But the idea of kind of the mall has changed as well. The mall is kind of more in an older definition, more like a meeting place or kind of a courtyard.
Okay,
so it makes sense in that regard. But yeah, when I think of mall, it's like, oh, where's the Hollister? Where's where's the Abercrombie?
Yeah, I've never heard the term used as anything but a shopping center. So I didn't realize it was used as a place to congregate. But that makes more sense. The Small World Mall. So this is basically kind of up to Small World, up to kind of where Mickey's Toontown is now. And it goes back to kind of where the Matterhorn is. Maybe not quite that far, but that whole walkway, the parade route, essentially. And it covered that area. I must say, the reason I know about this at all is because of a promotional video that was done with Mary-Kate and Ashley Olsen. You experienced it in person, but do you happen to remember this kind of promotional thing?
I don't remember the promotional thing. I've definitely seen it, post. All of their promotional material from the 80s and 90s is so fantastic and nostalgic for me. So this goes right up my alley anyways. I love that little promotional video that they put together.
Yeah, I do as well. the first thing you see when you enter Afternoon Avenue was this amazing arch that this goes back to the whole, if I saw this today, I don't know how it would feel, but it being tied to this nostalgic piece for me, I love it. It was like this very 90s kind of inflated tubes with a hot air balloon on top. And it was a very different vibe from the rest of Disneyland, which is probably another reason why it might have upset people. But to me, it's super iconic and I love it. Kind of curious how you feel about it.
Looking back on it, it definitely feels cheap. Like, oh, we just got this inflatable sign made. But, like, it does definitely fit the time. It fits kind of the kitschiness of it. And for it only running for however many months, 8 months or so.
Which was the purpose, by the way. It's not like it was 8 months because it failed. This was supposed to be a very temporary thing, and it was very temporary. And I think in a lot of ways it was a test for Mickey's Toontown as well.
I was going to bring that up. I think that the Afternoon Avenue was a test of, does Mickey's Toontown work as kind of a concept geared towards a younger audience? But also, how do these characters, like Scrooge McDuck, Chip, Dale, how do all of these characters translate to an audience at the parks? Because that was kind of unheard of. Most of the attractions weren't based even in the stuff that was becoming popular at that time. Like, we didn't get stuff till way later.
Yeah, for sure. And when we entered this land, it was very much inspired by Duckburg, USA, which on the East Coast, they'd kind of already done this with Mickey's Starland or originally Birthday Land. It's interesting because that was Mickey-centric. This was Afternoon Avenue-centric, but they both kind of focused in on Duckburg, which I guess was just popular at the time and kind of a Toontown that existed already. So a lot of the building facades were Duckburg, USA. We had Scrooge's Vault. We had Duckburg City Hall. And I mean, these were flats. When you look at them, I mean, they were just painted flats. And yeah, they look hella cheap, but there's something so cool about it. And they were all photo ops, and the characters were often there to be part of those photo ops. But I don't know, when did you go? Did you go early on? Do you know, like how old were you?
Typically, my family would go kind of take the car trip to Disneyland, like almost like right after school got out. So I want to say this was a June vacation that we were on. So it was kind of right in the middle of its run. I do remember a lot of the kind of flat cutouts. There was actually a Duckburg jail, though. I vividly remember, having my picture taken there with Scrooge, like just not too far away, which I think, again, lends itself to the idea that Toontown was a possibility if this worked, because Toontown has their little jail as well.
Yeah. Do you remember seeing these sets and like having a was it like a homecoming moment, or did you even know that this was a thing when you went? Because this was obviously something new for a local kid. But I don't know. Did you know it was going to be there? Were you looking forward to seeing it, or was it just kind of like, what is this?
Yeah, I don't have a memory of like seeing an advertisement or seeing anything about Disneyland and then specifically going for that. We were going for general Disneyland, but I personally was very excited about the Afternoon Avenue as soon as I saw it, because it was connected to the things that I was into. Like, I definitely love all of the older films. I love, some of the attractions that were originals, but when you talk about like Baloo being out meeting people in his, flight captain outfit or whatever, like that kind of stuff was really appealing to me because I was just watching that on Thursday, so it made sense to me to go to this. And despite its, for a better term, cheapness in the sense of how quickly it was put together, it was really exciting because, to my knowledge, at that time, I had not seen any overlays to attractions prior to that. So I was familiar with Autopia, but I had this like new experience because of the overlays that they were putting on attractions over there.
Yeah, and one could argue that this was obviously focused toward kids, and one could argue, oh, well, they already have Fantasyland for that. But this is a totally different vibe. Like, it's just a very, very, very different vibe than anything else in Disneyland at that point. And I think that's probably what made it so exciting. And I'm pretty sure successful. I believe this was a very successful campaign, even if adults looked at it as kind of crappy and cheap. I think the kids loved it. It certainly made an impression on me, who's never even witnessed it in person. Although it came a little close on 90s night. We'll get into that in a bit. But yeah, it was super cool. Did you happen to remember getting the map that they were giving out, where you could get stamps at all these different locations throughout Afternoon Avenue? And they recreated this for Disneyland After Dark 90s night. I didn't know that this was a thing, the stamp thing. And I thought it was something created just for 90s night. But I got to tell you, I did it. It was thrilling. And like, as I look at the original map, it's hanging on my wall right now, the one from 90s night. And it was basically an exact replica. And I was like, holy crap, like that is so cool. I love that so much. Do you happen to remember collecting the stamps?
No, I was definitely an avid, character signature collector.
As we all were back in the day.
Youth. Absolutely. Yeah. So I don't know if I didn't know about the stamps, but I kind of just didn't care because I had my own like little collection of signatures that I needed to get. So that was my, quote unquote stamp collection.
I need to find my autograph book. Gosh, I hope I still have it somewhere. Do you still have yours?
I still have mine. And actually, I decided a couple of months ago to take it to the park and got some signatures. And actually, the Mickey that was there recognized that it was a much older book and, pointed out. And I had to like ask the attendant that they were next to. And Mickey's trying to tell you that they've been around since this book was around. And I was like, oh, that's amazing. I'm glad that Mickey recognized that.
Do they still sell new autograph books? Is that still a piece of merchandise?
Yeah, you can still buy an autograph book and and a pen with the like wired Mickey kind of thing on top.
Yeah, I got a little worried when you said you brought it because I was like, oh gosh, is that still part of character training? Like, do these characters learn how to do these signatures still? Because, I mean, it was huge. I feel like when I was a kid, everybody had them. Now the selfie has kind of replaced that. But yeah, that's so fun. I loved those books. Those were great. So in any case, the map was super fun. And it was a free map that these days it would probably be $5 and you'd get a pin at the end or something like that. What am I saying? $5, $10.
Yeah, let's say the egg hunt usually for Easter is about 10.
Yeah, it started as 5. That's what made me go with 5 in my head. But remember when the egg hunt was 5 and it literally just goes up $1 every year.
Say, this year it's going to be like 12 to 15, easy, like no question in my mind.
Yep, people love it, so they do it. You mentioned you got to meet Baloo in his pilot wardrobe there, and this was an interesting one because most of the characters were out among Afternoon Avenue wandering around, but Baloo had his own dressing room. And this dressing room was essentially the underpass that brings you into what is now Mickey's Toontown. That was just backstage area at that point. Mickey's Toontown hadn't been built, or maybe was under construction. I'm not sure.
I believe it was under construction at the time.
Okay. So as you went under the underpass, they kind of put like a temporary building and they made a dressing room for Baloo. Why this character? I'm not sure. It was an interesting choice, but it was definitely like a test for Mickey's Barn later on and meeting Mickey Mouse and Mickey's Toontown. But I don't know. Do you have any thoughts on why Baloo was the character choice?
I think that you're dead on with that. Thinking about that time period, pretty much all of the characters were free roaming characters. There was never a place to go specifically to meet characters. Walt Disney World had that. They've always kind of done that as part of their MO, but Disneyland was always about free roaming characters. And I wonder if this was truly a test to see if Mickey's house, if Minnie's house would stand up in the idea that people would come to it, wait in line. I don't remember if Baloo's little dressing room area had kind of a queue that was decorated in any way. But I do remember like actually being in the dressing room with Baloo as kind of a place to take a photo. So I think that you're pretty much dead on that.
It's interesting how you mentioned how Walt Disney World was doing that first, which is it's true. But it's interesting because these days we obviously have that at Disneyland as well. There are locations for characters. There are queues to meet up in. And one of the things that I know a lot of like Orlando friends who, when they come to Disneyland, love is that that's not 100% for Disneyland. We still have wandering characters. That apparently is like a no-go in Florida, or really, really, really rare. And I always just take it for granted that, like, yeah, I mean, it's not uncommon for me to walk through Fantasyland and just be like, hey, look, there's Geppetto or whomever. But that is like very much not a thing in Orlando. So even though we've grabbed on to the whole, meet and greet locations on this coast, we still kind of have the wandering, and the Florida folks tend to be a little jealous of that.
Let them be jealous.
Now, you mentioned how some of the attraction had overlays, and this, I'm trying to think, 1991, would there have been overlays really at that point? I'd have to do dig deep into that, but off the top of my head, I can't think of any. But we did have, first of all, the motorboat cruise. I never personally experienced, like, one of the original origins. Did you ever experience it?
This is actually the only way that I experienced it. So
okay.
Having gummy characters was the only way I saw the motorboat cruise.
Okay, so the motorboat cruise became the motorboat cruise to Gummi Glen. And this is an area that right now is a seating area, at least part of it. A lot of it's been built over and such. But right now it's a seating area kind of across from the Matterhorn. If you were walking toward It's a Small World, and there's a little body of water there, but it went through various iterations of a motorboat cruise. And so they decided to give it a Gummi Glen overlay for this. And listen, the story was Duke Igthorn and his band of ogres were attempting to steal the latest batch of gummy berry juice as you steered your boat past a series of plywood cutouts leading to the hidden source of the magical juice. Now, I think that's the thing that bothered most people about this, was the fact that they were like flat plywood cutouts, which is very basic, very inexpensive, not very Disney, right? You'd expect at least, statues of some sort, some three-dimensional figures. But I don't know. When I look at videos and photos of this, I'm like, I kind of wish I could go back in time and experience this.
Right. It's got that same kind of charm that, especially with like the Disney fandom, we kind of fall in love with attractions that maybe aren't necessarily beloved by like the larger pop culture. I think like Living with the Land is a great example of that. Of like most people going to Epcot, the general public would look at it and be like, why would I ride this? But like, Disney fans like have a real appreciation for that kind of thing. And I think that this falls in that same category of like, if you grew up with these characters, during this time period, and you kind of love like that bit of kind of hokey charm that Disney pulls out every now and then, I think that this fits that.
Yeah, Disney can get away with a lot, especially these days, much more so than even in 1991.
Oh, yeah.
Where I think I've said it many times on here, but the case in point is when Luigi's Rollickin' Roadsters opened, and there was like a 4-hour wait. And I was like, there's no other theme park in the world, even Universal, who has, an avid fan base still. But there's no other theme park in the world that could open a C-ticket attraction like this and have a 4-hour wait. It's just like the FOMO among Disney fandom is extreme. And I don't know. I just kind of wish I could take a motorboat cruise to Gummi Glen, to be completely honest. But the videos, that's another thing that like makes Afternoon Avenue kind of so mysterious, is there are very few videos and photos of a lot of this. And as I was doing research, I definitely kept coming across like the same content over and over again, which also it's kind of a time forgotten. But do you have like a lot of personal photos from there?
I don't. I have the photo from being in the jail, at the Duckburg jail, but I don't think I have any photos from this particular attraction. I do remember being on it, and unfortunately, the motorboat cruise is gone these days. Although, to be honest, it wasn't like the greatest attraction of all time, and I think we'll get into like Autopia too, where it's like it used to be multiple different types of Autopias before they combined them all together to create a quote-unquote better version of Autopia. The motorboat cruise was very small. Its footprint is much smaller than Autopia is now. And so, unfortunately, there's not much you can do with that area either. So it just kind of, like you said, has become a seating area. Before that, it was like one of the very last smoking areas at Disneyland. It's a shame, but also I wish that they would do something with that area.
Yeah, it did officially close on January 11th, 1992, and they did take over part of it for actually a very short-lived show called Light Magic. If you remember that nighttime spectacular parade, they built the kind of step up section in the Fantasyland, or in the It's a Small World Mall area. So that used to be water, essentially, and they built all that up. So they have like slowly been eating away at that water area. What happens to it in the future? Who knows? I'm sure at some point it will be all filled in. But for now, there is that little piece of water that's still there. But as I said, a part of the ride story had to do with the gummy berry juice, which was a very popular item. Of course, with a special event like this, Disney has specialty food. Do you happen to remember the frozen gummy berry juice bars that they had available?
I remember some themed items, but I personally don't remember eating anything themed to any of the afternoon characters. My family was all about like churros and frozen bananas, and so that's kind of what we always stuck to.
Yeah, and I don't think themed food was nearly as big as it is now. This is probably one of the earlier ones, to be honest, like a temporary themed food, and they certainly weren't thinking about, Instagram back then and making it photographable, but it's kind of fun to see that even back then they were still doing a little bit of the themed food for this kind of special pop-up event. But the motorboat cruise to Gummy Glen was not the only overlay. As you hinted at, there was the Rescue Rangers Raceway. And this took over Fantasyland Autopia. And this is another thing I know about, I've heard about, but so there was a Fantasyland and a Tomorrowland Autopia? And was one geared toward younger children? What's the story behind this?
So initially, as Disneyland was building out, they had Autopia, and then they created Junior Autopia, and then they had Midget Autopia, which was the smallest of them. They combined the Junior and the Midget tracks to create the Fantasyland Autopia, which was geared more towards a younger demographic, a smaller track layout than the Tomorrowland one. And nowadays, right, we've combined them all to kind of create this massive, larger footprint that is Autopia.
So there were 3 Autopias at one point.
At one point, there were 3 different Autopia rides.
Wow, that's crazy. And they were all part of tomorrow. No, because there was a Fantasyland one. So there were multiple Autopias next to each other, but in multiple different lands. That's kind of fascinating. Wow,
it is. Yeah, talk about running out of ideas. Like we would. The Disney fandom, if this were to happen today and they'd say, we're going to open another Autopia right next to that Autopia, there would be so many people on social media just devouring Disney over that kind of thing. So yeah, I'm glad that it's only one these days. But I mean, even now, people say you should get rid of Autopia. But that's another story for a different time.
Yeah, now I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think Midget Autopia ended up in Marceline, Missouri. I believe they donated those vehicles to Marceline, and I remember going, and I don't think the track was running at the time, but I don't know if they've kept it up and if it's still going or not.
Yeah, I mean, that version was super small. It was basically just like, a circle that you kind of drove around. So its footprint wasn't very small, or it wasn't very big. And I think that's the same at Marceline.
Okay, cool. And so one of them, the kiddie version, the Fantasyland Autopia, was taken over, and the story was that drivers had to maneuver themselves out of the evil clutches of Fat Cat and his gang. So, a little retheming here, similar. It was like the plywood flat cutouts along the racetrack. And do you remember riding this one?
This is the most vivid feeling, memory that I have. And I felt really great about this. Chip and Dale were 2 of my favorite characters. I loved like all of the new characters. And so I was in love with this attraction.
Oh, that's so cool. I just remember for so long, I would only ever see Chip and Dale in their certain little uniforms there. And I remember when that kind of dwindled down and we started seeing like classic Chip and Dale again, it was a treat for a very long time. And now it's the opposite. If I see them in those outfits, I get kind of excited these days. But but at the time, it was like a rarity to see just, naked Chip and Dale. They were always
Right.
walking around in those costumes. So yeah, another kind of cheap overlay, but let's think about this for a second. An 8-month promotional thing got 2 ride overlays? That's kind of crazy.
It is kind of crazy. And I mean, to take up, when you think about like how big the space is between kind of the exit of Fantasyland, quote unquote exit of Fantasyland towards Small World. I know that that's still all Fantasyland, but it feels like such a distinct break, especially nowadays, right? It's such a long haul to get from one to the other. That area just kind of being like overtaken by this temporary thing from characters that really only appealed to a very young demographic is pretty amazing, considering they didn't do any of that kind of thing before. They didn't, like we're so used to Disney having festivals all the time, and that just wasn't the case.
That's a good comparison, because it was like that. Like, some of the festival booths that pop up aren't the nicest of things, but we kind of accept them popping up along the park. Epcot, they're essentially home now. It's more often a festival than not. But yeah, that's an interesting comparison to something like this. But it was super, super temporary. And that's the thing, I think, when people kind of give it crap, you just got to keep that in mind. Like, this was meant to be very temporary. Right. And it did its job. So that was cool. There was a stage show. And at the time, Videopolis had just closed, soon before. And when Videopolis closed, they turned it into what is now the Fantasyland Theater. I'm not sure exactly what it was called at the time, but they had a show there called Plain Crazy, which I love the title here because, of course, it ties into Mickey Mouse's first animated short, but it has nothing to do with that. It features Don Carnage and Fat Cat, and their plot is essentially to take over the X-22 spy plane. It features Baloo, you got Chip, you got Dale, you've got a launch pad, and this was a pretty, if anything, this was the part of Afternoon Avenue that I would say I have to like the least. This was a terrible show.
Yeah. yeah. Going back and thinking about it, though, the dressing room for Baloo now, makes sense. I totally forgot about this show, but it makes sense that Baloo would have a dressing room because he has to get on stage for the show with all of these characters. But yeah, it's really difficult to pull off a show like this, especially when a majority of the characters are not face characters. Mm-hmm. So, and for a show like that being named after a Mickey Mouse cartoon, I get it. It sort of makes sense because the show's based around, flying planes and whatnot.
So that's the mistake number one.
Not good. Yeah.
Do not theme a low budget stage show in a theme park where like one of the main set pieces is an airplane, because like it was literally one of those cheap things like you see like in an elementary school play where some of the characters had like an airplane built around them that they would like run around in, sort of thing. Yeah. It was just hokey and not a great story and not great music. This was not a highlight for Afternoon Avenue, at least in my opinion.
I would also make the suggestion that we have it pretty good as far as stage shows these days.
It's true.
Like our level of Disney stage show appreciation is high. Our demand is high. We've got a huge, beautiful theater over at California Adventure that's done 3 or 4 different shows now that have been amazing. Like you were saying, everything that's at the Fantasyland Theater has been pretty good, at least decent. And to my knowledge, like going back to the early 90s, there were not nearly as many shows like this as there are nowadays. Most things were like the Dapper Dans or stuff like that. So to have a big stage production, I guess maybe they didn't know what they were doing or getting into when they decided to do this stage production. I'm not sure, because you look at what they do even with temporary shows now, and it's incredible.
It's true. I feel like that department has certainly grown considerably since 1991. So that's a fair point. But yeah, the stage show, not a highlight, but perhaps, building something for the future, which was a good thing. Now, the train station that is now Mickey's Toontown train station, at one point wasn't really being utilized, but for this Afternoon Avenue, it was. And one of the more interesting things is that at the time, the voiceover on this train was the voice of Thurl Ravenscroft, who most people know as Tony the Tiger, and of course we hear in the Haunted Mansion and Tiki Room and many other Disney projects. And he was actually replaced for the section of track going from Frontierland or New Orleans Square, I believe, to this Afternoon Avenue. And the voices you would hear on that section were Baloo and Kit Cloudkicker instead. So, I mean, he got the boot for animated characters, which probably might have pissed some purists off. Although I feel like the purists were far fewer back in 1991. But still, that's a pretty big deal to have a whole... once again, for a temporary overlay in a small section of the park, they updated one of the most staple attractions in Disneyland. That's like kind of impressive.
Yeah, I guess the kind of lesson behind all this, right, is that the overlays of the afternoon, like, even though they aren't grand in what they did, there were a lot of things that they did. And so there's a little piece here and there of everything to kind of make up one huge festival. And it kind of worked.
And it did seem to inspire future things. So, like, I haven't fact checked all of this, so I may be wrong on some, but like, we can't immediately think of any other overlays that were a regular thing. So we've got ride overlays that eventually became a regular thing, perhaps inspired by this. We got this gummy berry juice snack, a themed food to a special event that probably wasn't the first, but may have inspired future things. We got this live stage show that up to that point was more of a dance club, which probably inspired future stage performances. So, like, there's a lot of little things that Afternoon Avenue potentially could have inspired. And there was even kind of a cavalcade that went along with this. I think they called it a parade, but if we look back at it today, very much a cavalcade, I would say. And it featured the characters. It was basically one kind of small float, a school bus, and then a car that Mickey and Minnie were in, which, by the way, as I was watching video of this, Mickey and Minnie are like in a car driving, but like, it didn't look like there was any space for a driver. And so I was like, oh my gosh, is Mickey driving this car? And is that safe? That's all I was thinking. Because I've seen his driving skills in Runaway Railway, and I'm not that impressed. So, yeah, I don't know. I was just watching that and being like, how is this thing going? I don't know. I digress.
I mean, the safety standards have definitely had to change over the years, so...
I know, I saw a character sitting on top of the school bus. I forget which character it was. And I was like, are they anchored in? Because I don't remember characters ever being anchored in when I was a kid.
No.
But I was like, on top of a school bus? I hope they're anchored in there.
You just got like Pete on top of that dragon, sitting like 20 feet in the air, just like hoping that he survives the night.
Yeah. Do you remember seeing this little cavalcade? Because I thought that this was a lot of fun.
I don't remember it offhand. Going back and having, seen a little bit of it, like it rings some memories of seeing just a lot of these characters around during that time period.
Do you have any other specific memories of visiting Afternoon Avenue that you'd like to touch upon?
I definitely, met some of the characters. Scrooge, Baloo, did the whole signature thing. I wondered... At that time, this was, I believe, prior to when Max had become a character,
yeah.
So I was kind of like thinking back on it. I'm like, oh, especially 90s Night, right? That was a big fixture of 90s Night was where you could meet Max and as Powerline. I'm kind of sad that like this didn't continue for various years because
this could have been an annual summer celebration easily.
Oh yeah, that block of cartoons was a huge selling point for many kids that were getting into Disney, from 1990 to like 95, 96. And so I'm surprised that they didn't bring it back because some of the characters that didn't make the cut because they had not, had their shows come out yet, I think they could have done wonders. And some of the shows that weren't super popular maybe could have become popular because of the, festival type of thing. It's a shame that they didn't. Because I would have loved to have met some of those characters. And so thinking back, I go like, I wish I would have been able to see like Max and PJ, Bonkers, Marsupilami, things like that. Like I would have loved to have seen those characters.
Yeah, I really do think this could have become an annual thing. Probably not for 8 months, nor should it have been. But like I feel like a summertime sort of pop-up could have easily worked for a good 5 to 10 years there. That would have been interesting. Yeah. I am kind of curious if there was ever any discussion and it was just like kind of vetoed due to budget. But like, let's face it, this is all in It's a Small World mall. I wonder if there was ever discussion about an It's a Small World overlay of some sort for this celebration, because the 2 other attractions that touched it did get overlays. Storybook Land Canal Boats did not, but that could have too, potentially, if they wanted to.
I bet because they did the motorboat ride, they decided not to touch that one because the similar boat ride type of thing. But had the motorboat ride not been there, I bet they would easily have done an overlay of that. And Small World, I bet the discussion would have gone as somebody, trying to sell it at Imagineering and everybody going like, no, that's too sacred of an attraction. You can't put characters in the ride. And then, years later, of course, we now have characters in the ride.
Little did they know. It would have, I bet you Afternoon Avenue inspired that. No, just
there
kidding.
You go.
So we've talked a little bit about Disneyland After Dark 90s Night, which happened in 2019. You may have experienced the real thing. I experienced the fake pop-up version of it. But I just remember the thing that impressed me so much about the 90s night version is, yes, it was way smaller in scale. This was a couple night event versus an 8-month event. But oh my gosh, did they hit all the right notes. They had flat photo op sort of things that were extremely reminiscent of the real Afternoon Avenue. I remember they had like an entrance. Obviously, they didn't build this giant archway with these tubes and hot air balloon, but they did recreate like these sort of columns made out of twisted balloons and stuff that like the second I looked at it, I was like, this totally has Afternoon Avenue vibes all over it. And I love that. As I mentioned, we got the map. I mean, I can't get over how similar the map looks and how cast members were there giving stamps. Apparently, when they first started doing this in the original Afternoon Avenue, they would let the guests stamp their own pages. But apparently, like, stamps were appearing all over Afternoon Avenue in wrong locations. So they're like, okay, we're going to have the cast member stamp the page for you moving forward. And, but yeah, they just did such a great job creating the vibe of Afternoon Avenue. And I was really impressed by that. And I mean, I still say to this day, I think one of my favorite Disneyland memories was Disneyland After Dark 90s Night. And this was a huge part of the reason why. I really never thought I'd get to experience Afternoon Avenue, and I have in a little way. And frankly, I'd be okay if they brought it back sometime as a nostalgic throwback, because I feel like it would do even better now than it did back then.
Well, they've rebooted at least one of those shows. And they've talked, I remember.
And they've made a movie about another.
They made a movie about another. They've had conversations about creating a whole quote unquote afternoon verse.
Yeah.
And bringing back a lot more shows. And they've teased that previously. And so anything's possible. The benefit of the, one night only kind of things that they've been doing, all these, after dark events, is that it does show what's popular and what's not still. And that 90s night, I remember I didn't go, but like seeing pictures and whatnot, like people were waiting in massive lines to meet some of these characters. They've got to be thinking about oh, we could easily bring back the shows. We could bring back these characters in the park. We could have more overlays. They've got to have a bunch of ideas surrounding some of this stuff.
I do, as much as I would love to see something like that become a more permanent thing, I do think the pop-up version is the smart way to do it, because let's face it, like, nostalgia is this thing that changes every 5 to 10 years. And like, we're just in that zone right now. I remember when 80s was huge. We're definitely in the 90s being huge right now because people are aging. And it's just like when you hit that middle age, you're like craving your decade. And so the 90s are huge. I even think we're getting into the kind of early 2000s kind of already, because that was 23 years ago. It's a long time ago. So I think it's kind of smart to make them temporary, but yeah, I would love to see something more permanent come out of it.
I mean, there's got to be eventually in the next few years, there's got to be like a 2000s like Disney Channel kind of night.
Oh, I'm sure that's being worked on. They've gone through
I'm sure.
They've basically gone through the 50s to 90s with these after dark events. Like the 80s got their own event, the 90s got their own event, and then they kind of like clumped a bunch of decades together from before that. So I'm sure the 2000 to 2010 night is coming soon, because if I'm remembering correctly, 80s night and 90s night both did very, very well. I attended both of them and I loved them both. And yeah, it'll happen, I'm pretty sure.
Yeah.
But the thing to say about Afternoon Avenue, I think, is that it really did fill a void, because I know it's hard to imagine these days Disneyland without Mickey's Toontown. But as we said, it did not exist. And this was just a super different vibe than the rest of it. And it worked. It did its job. And if that listener is still listening, who said he wouldn't listen, haha, I got you to listen. And number two, I think it served its purpose. As much as adults may not have liked it, I think it worked.
It did work. And I think that the people who went, maybe reluctantly even, have fond memories. And I think that you can look back on it and see like the progress that they've made with Toontown, with some of the other overlays that they do these days. Like it always blows my mind. And I know like some people love it, some people hate it, but when they have like Jack Skellington and Sally and everybody in the Haunted Mansion, like they pull that off, they flip it over in like 2 or 3 weeks. It's absolutely incredible how quickly they do it. And I think that just kind of shows like, oh, okay, we can do these overlays for a few months at a time. Let's just get better at it. And we've seen that progress, over the last few years. Like every time that they do one for Halloween or Christmas or whatever they decide to do, like they're always fantastic. I always trust Disney to do great overlays. And I think that started with, at least for me personally, with the Afternoon Avenue.
And let's face it, like these days, the overlay is kind of considered from the get-go, before an attraction even opens. If you look at something like Guardians of the Galaxy Mission Breakout, in year one, what did that open? In May, I think? I think it was the month was May. In October or even September, Monsters After Dark existed. So right. The attraction had not even been open for 1 full year, and we already had a Halloween overlay for it. So like the concept of an overlay is considered from day number 1, it feels like, especially in screen-based attractions. It's not as simple as everybody likes to think it is, but it is a simpler way of overlaying an attraction. So if there's screens, I think they're always considering that. And I should research like how far back that goes. I mean, let's just stop and think for a second. What is the first attraction overlay that you can think of? Because for me, it really does feel like it might have been Afternoon Avenue.
And that even goes beyond Disney, right? Like Knott's Berry Farm does a bunch of great overlays for Halloween, not just like the haunted houses, but like, they take their water ride and turn it into a Halloween, the Halloween Hootenanny.
That is fantastic overlay. Yeah.
It's so great. And so the kind of overlay idea, or even the festival idea, has reached so much further than just Disney. It's become a amusement park / theme park kind of staple these days. And you're right, like they do consider that stuff when they start building things out.
It's interesting that you mentioned Knott's Berry Farm because they have an overlay for the Halloween season. And actually, no, it's for the Peanuts celebration that they do on their little kiddie train ride and their whole Camp Snoopy. But it is very much an Afternoon Avenue feel where it is flats of the Peanuts characters all along the train trail there. So that's actually interesting. I hadn't thought about that until you mentioned Knott's and their overlays. But yeah, that goes all the way back to an Afternoon Avenue-like sort of feel. So if you've never experienced Afternoon Avenue and you want to see what it feels like, go to Knott's during the Peanuts celebration and you'll get a little bit of that vibe.
I could talk about like early 90s, Disneyland for a long time, but truly an unprecedented type of attraction, I guess if you want to call it, like that the Afternoon Avenue was. Like to be able to promote something like that, it seems crazy. Like I'm sure that my parents were like, why are they doing this? And I'm sure a lot of people that had been to Disneyland for years and years were like, why would they do this? Why not create something more permanent instead that feels, long-term better rather than just these standard cutouts? But it definitely created an atmosphere for at least our generation, more like a millennial and younger kind of generation that craves festivals and, pop-up things, one-night only events, things like that feel really, really special. It goes back to that FOMO idea, right?
And the other thing is we always talk about this today, how Walt Disney World is a tourist resort and Disneyland Resort is very much a locals resort. And, I mentioned Mickey's Birthday Land and Starland and stuff, which were much more permanent than Afternoon Avenue. Well, this just kind of like leans into the whole conversation of Disneyland constantly needs to be changing because it's such a locals park. So this is even kind of ties into those early days of, great, let's do this 8-month thing, bring in these locals. We'll get them here maybe one extra time this year because of this. Even though it was so much longer ago, it still kind of ties into the way that the two different resorts operate today. And it worked. It was a good test. So I think that just confirmed, guess what? Mickey's Toontown is really going to do well here. And listen, we just got our second version of Mickey's Toontown. So something about it works. And it's kind of incredible.
It does work. And so that the same kind of idea where we have like Chinese New Year celebration for a month or so, that works. And all those types of other celebrations that kind of come and go yearly that bring guests back to the park multiple times a year, especially for locals, that kind of stuff I think does stem from this one promotional idea based around the early 90s TV shows.
This is a little bit off topic, but just talking about like bringing people in throughout the year. Can I tell you, how like we kind of have the annual pass problem here in SoCal, or the magic key holder issue of, reservations and all that stuff. And there were too many pass holders at one point. They're like, this isn't working. We need to get rid of them. I genuinely think we should just have a seasonal pass where it gets you in once per season. You get to enjoy the different, celebrations that are going on each season, and that's it. And then just have regular day tickets or multi-day tickets. But like, I feel like that would resolve the annual pass holder issue, although I know attendance has been down, so perhaps not the best time to do something like that. But I've always loved the idea of just a seasonal pass that would get you in like 4 times a year, which I think would be appealing to a lot of people, like a lot of people.
Yeah. Or even going back to the ticket idea where, you bought up to a 4-day or 5-day ticket, but you could kind of use them whenever you wanted to, rather than, I believe if you buy a ticket now, like as soon as you check in for your first day, you've only got a certain number of days before that totally expires. So if you bought like you were saying, a ticket or a pass that said you can come 4 to 6 times in a year, it starts January 1st, ends December 31st. That does seem appealing for a lot of people, especially considering the pricing of Magic Keys continues to just go up and up, pricing a lot of people out.
Yeah. Just to go back to It's a Small World for a second, I was thinking about this when you were talking about, I'd love to see something like this today. You know what they would 100% do? If Afternoon Avenue were something brand new today, the way that they would work It's a Small World into it is they would have an awesome projection mapping show on It's a Small World as part of Afternoon Avenue. And I got to tell you, I would be there for it. That would be awesome. And it makes me a little sad that projection mapping didn't exist to the way it does today back in 1991, because that would have been epic.
Yeah, my favorite place, and I hate to say this publicly because I don't want people to show up, but my favorite place, because I think it's actually the best version of the nightly fireworks show, is at It's a Small World. Because it's so flat, the projection mapping works so much better there than it does on the castle or even on the Main Street buildings. And so to me, especially like during the weeknights when they don't do fireworks, they just do the projection mapping. I think that the show really excels at It's a Small World.
Yeah, there are definitely pros and cons to both. I've done the different areas, and I would agree if you really want to focus and see what the projections are, Small World is a great place to do that. You're not going to see the flying characters, but frankly, if you're on Main Street, you're far enough away that does that matter anyway. And you're very close to some pyro if you're near It's a Small World, so you'll get the big bang there. But yeah, gosh, I'd love to see a projection mapping of Afternoon Avenue. That'd be fantastic.
Well, start pitching it.
Let's do it. Let's bring it back. Another 90s night, please. Honestly, I hope 90s night comes back. Some of the, a lot of the Disneyland After Dark events have come back. So I would love to see that one come back. They'd probably mix 80s and 90s night, I think, if they were to do it again. But
that's fine. I would still go.
Well, this was a fun little convo about Afternoon Avenue. I am super jealous that you got to experience it in person, but thanks for sharing your stories with all of us. Before I let you go, anything you want to plug?
Oh, the main thing I'm doing these days is creating video essays, mostly about Disney stuff, over at youtube.com/Modern Mouse. So if you look up Modern Mouse, not Modest Mouse, the band, that gets, if you Google me, that ends up being there. But Modern Mouse, I've been doing a lot of like fun narrative stuff, as well as actually dividing films into eras. Yeah, it's been a lot of fun. I've really enjoyed some of the stuff I've been making recently. So go check that out.
Talk about your recent Muppet video.
So the latest Muppet video is about how stoner comedy and the drug culture of the late 60s and early 70s kind of inspired the Muppets and Jim Henson Productions as a whole, and how that style of comedy kind of continued with the Muppets throughout the decades of time. And now, in recent times, we've seen maybe a comeback of that. And I also kind of highlight that the Muppets probably, and their style of comedy probably inspired some other styles of comedy. It all kind of blends together, but a lot of it comes from the end of the Hays Code in the 60s, as well as kind of the hippie movement and drug culture that all kind of happened around the same time. And then that plays into how the Muppets became what they became.
I love that concept. What a fun idea for a video. And you did it, and that's so much fun. People should check it out for sure. And by the way, as we were talking about this, I'm sure you've heard about, the stories that have been told about how at one point they wanted to do a celebration where Kermit and the gang took over Disneyland. And I was just thinking, as we were talking about Afternoon Avenue, that would have been a great little, even if they didn't take over all of Disneyland, if they did a very similar kind of that section of the park where Afternoon Avenue was, if they did a Muppet takeover of that would have been thrilling. That would have been, and these days, once again, a really cool projection mapping on Small World of the Muppets would be cool. I would love it.
I mean, they've got the theater back there to do like a stage production if they'd like to. I would love to see. One of the things that was amazing a couple of years back for Christmas, they brought out those characters on a bus and went down Main Street and they sang Christmas carols, but it was in person. It was like real puppets. It wasn't, I love, the 3D show, but to see an actual puppet in real life, to see Kermit in real life just is amazing. It was one of the great things that they had at Magic Kingdom for a while. And I would love to see more of that kind of live puppetry being put into the parks, because the Muppets have zero representation at Disneyland right now.
Which is crazy, right? Like, I think about it. This is a conversation Disney fans, at least Muppet fans, love to get into. Is like, why isn't there more Muppets? Why isn't there more Muppets? And when you look at Walt Disney World, there actually is and has been a decent representation of the Muppets. But yeah, Disneyland's screwed. And I got to tell you, right now they're playing the Disney 100 music loop of like songs from all through the years of the company, a lot of retired stuff. And whenever I hear the Muppet Show theme, I just get angry because they did this even before Disney 100. I'm like, this is such a tease to play in the Esplanade of Disneyland. That and Honey, I Shrunk the Audience, I just get angry. I'm like, you took these from us and now you're rubbing it in our face, and I am not okay with that.
Listen, we could both agree on the Muppet thing. I love...
Are you talking crap about Honey, I Shrunk the Audience?
I'm not. No. I think it was a great show for what it was at the time. I'd say that because the Tomorrowland Theater, when they brought back Captain EO, I went because I was like, gotta pay respects, you know? But that show did not age well. It hurt my eyeballs to the 10th degree. I cannot imagine going and seeing Wayne Szalinski and just like crying from the 3D hurting my eyes so badly. So if they could update and have a new show, I'm all for that. But I just don't want to hurt my eyes.
I would just like to see the space used, because an empty venue is just heartbreaking. And that space isn't being used for anything right now. And it hasn't been for a long time. So, well, Josh, thank you so much for coming on and talking Afternoon Avenue. I'll talk to you later, sir.
Thank you.
Thanks for tuning into this episode. Don't miss any future episodes by subscribing and following Disney with a Z, coast to coast on your favorite podcast app, where episodes are available 24/7. If you're a longtime listener of the show, thank you. And if you have the means, consider supporting the show over on Patreon. By joining Disney Coast to Coast's Patreon membership, you'll gain access to extra bonuses, including live stream Ask Me Anythings, unreleased episodes, and more bonus content. Take a look at all that's available by clicking the Patreon link in this episode's description, and thank you for considering. Until next time, anything you need can be found in this episode's description. From additional information and links discussed in this episode found in the show notes, to the DCTC hotline where you can leave a voicemail and be heard on a future episode, contact info to reach me, access to the show's official website, some free gifts from me to you, and so much more. So be sure to check out this episode's description. Other than that, folks, have a magical day. Bye!